Good morning. Morning. So this is part 3 of my talk. Was anyone here at the James Burke talk I did yesterday? Yay! This morning, I woke up having this epiphany because I got that whole idea of connections, the kind of wonderful tapestry of engineering connections that James was talking a little bit about yesterday. So I've completely rewritten my talk at about 9 o'clock. So we're going to do a connections talk. This is my spacesuit over here, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. But the connections are, what does a bra, a tomato worm caterpillar, a to-do list, the Beatles, and a rubber tree have to do with the Apollo spacesuit? So as I go through my talk, you'll be able to hopefully link all these different ideas up. So this is the spacesuits that I'm talking about. This isn't just the most famous of all the Apollo 11 photographs. This is perhaps the most famous photograph of all time. It is, of course, Buzz Aldrin standing in the Sea of Tranquility. But when we look at this photograph, we are, of course, not just looking at a human being. We're looking at a manufactured object. We're looking at a piece of technology, a piece of engineering that in 1962, when Kennedy made his famous "We choose to go to the moon" speech, they had no idea how to make. But this is the result. It's called the A7-L Lunar Excursion Suit. It was made, well, I'll tell you who it's made by in a little while, but it's a miracle of engineering. And for those at the end, if you'd like to take a picture of this suit, I'm going to talk a little bit about that one in a while. It might be called a one-man spaceship of the smallest possible dimensions. That's exactly what a spacesuit is. It has to do all the things that a spaceship has to do. It has to give you pressure. It has to regulate temperature. It has to give you oxygen to breathe. It has to be able to get rid of carbon dioxide and waste, and all these different things that you would expect on a spaceship. And of course, things that we don't have to worry about here on planet Earth because we have this wonderful spacesuit called an atmosphere. But actually, the story of the spacesuit, we have to really go back in time a long way. Probably the most important bit of engineering ever is this, the invention of the needle. Suddenly, a bit of technology like this from 35,000 years ago enabled us to stitch together materials, animal skins, whatever it was. And suddenly, by engineering clothing, we could migrate further, we could live in different places around the world, thanks to this wonderful invention. And this is kind of where we start when we get from here to the spacesuit. What about something like this? When we think about the genesis of the spacesuit, a spacesuit has to be this. It has to be a suit of armor, a medieval suit of armor. It has to be very, very tough. It has to protect you from things like micrometeoroids and abrasions and all kinds of things. And actually, you can see the similarities between the engineering of something like a suit of armor and something like this over here. I love this. It's called the Old Gentleman. It kind of sounds a bit weird. It's one of the earliest diving suits. This is I think it's a Finnish diving suit made of reindeer hides. And again, the similarities between something like this and a spacesuit are obvious. I mean, certainly functionally, a diving suit like this let us explore the bottom of bodies of water, of oceans. It protected us. By wearing clothes like this, diving suits, suits of armor, we can extend ourselves as human beings. We can become more than human. This kind of technology lets us explore further. So there's a bit of a genesis of a spacesuit here. And of course, things like temperature. Here's an Inuit family here, stitching together of furs, of skins, lets us explore regions of the world that we could not have explored before we had the invention of sewing. And again, when we look at our spacesuit, we can see a little bit of that technology of old woven into the fabric of that. But really what I want to talk about is this, the idea of pressure. Of course, down here, we live at the bottom of an ocean of air. And of course, we don't feel the weight of air around us, even though air has weight. And that's because, of course, the air is pressing all around us. Now, if you're at the bottom of a swimming pool, for example, if you dive into a swimming pool, you can quite happily swim to the bottom of a swimming pool, and you're not going to get crushed by the weight of the water. You might feel it on your eardrums, perhaps. You might feel it a little bit. But again, like the air, the water is pressing all around you. Now, if I took you out of that swimming pool and then picked up that swimming pool and put it on top of you, it would squash you flat. And that's, of course, because the forces are all going, just in that case, going one direction. But we live at the bottom of an ocean of air. We just don't notice it. But as we go higher and higher and higher, the air gets thinner and thinner and thinner, the pressure becomes less, and so we have not evolved to survive in those conditions. And so we have to engineer our way out of that. And of course, the invention of flight, so the Wright brothers, 1903, right after that, aviation really started to kick off, and that we began to explore higher and higher and higher. And so doctors and engineers realized that if we did want to fly higher, we're going to need to engineer some kind of pressure suit. This is the very first one I could find. So this is 1918. This is a patent of the very, very first example of a pressure suit. And I love this. And it's basically a spacesuit. If you look at my spacesuit over there, 1969, and you look at this, they're kind of identical. The materials have changed, obviously, but the basic premise is the same. You have some kind of suit which you can pump up with air, some kind of helmet that you can put air in, and that's it. But this is the real genesis of the spacesuit begins here. A gentleman called Wiley Post and another guy called Russell Coley. This is him. This is Wiley Post. Wiley Post was one of these early aviators that I was talking about. So 1930s, Wiley Post realized that high above us there is a fast-moving current of air called the jet stream. And he was a kind of daredevil aviator, and he realized that if he could fly in the jet stream, he could fly faster than anyone else. And he wanted to break all kinds of aviation speed records. But he also knew up at that height, the air would be too thin, the air would be too rarefied to support life. So he had to come up with some kind of way of doing that. Now, actually in my bag, what I have here, I found this in a junk shop the other day. And let's see if yeah. So this is it. This is a copy I actually found of Popular Mechanics. This is from 1934. And if you all pull out your copy of Popular Mechanics from 1934, I found this. So this is a little article about Wiley Post. I actually think this is pretty rare because I've never seen this anywhere else. And in it, he describes basically his invention for flying up there in the jet stream. So I'll show you. So this is the page I'm looking at here. And it's his description of how one might do it. Basically what he's saying you couldn't pressurize the cabin of the aircraft because that would make the aircraft too heavy, too complicated. So he came up with this idea of designing an inflatable suit so you could carry this bubble of pressure around with you. And if we zoom in, we can read it. It says, "My idea is to employ a suit, something like a diver's outfit, which the pilot can wear and which can be blown up with air or oxygen to the required pressure. Such a suit does not weigh much and is flexible enough to permit normal handling of controls." So that's I think the very first that I could find real kind of description of a spacesuit proper. And this is it. This is what he came up with. He designed and made this with the help of a gentleman called Russell Coley. Russell Coley actually worked in women's fashion, but worked for a company called B.F. Goodrich, who obviously you may have heard of, they make car tires, but they work with rubber. And B.F. Goodrich became one of the companies that was instrumental in developing the spacesuit proper. But all you've got is essentially a rubberized suit, which you inflate, and a welded aluminium helmet. I actually, a couple of years ago, I went to the Smithsonian, where most of the spacesuits are kept. And they very kindly let me get the Wiley Post suit out. It's not actually on display. And this is it, just so you can see how it works. So here, basically, you've just got some cotton underwear, which is for comfort, okay? And then this is the real bit of magic. This is basically a rubberized, almost like a bicycle inner tube, like a human-shaped bicycle inner tube, which you pump up with air, and that creates the pressure, the gas pressure that lets you explore. And then over the top of that, you have this wonderful, very, very heavy canvas and leather garment, and you can see how the joints have hoops around it. leather boots, leather gloves. And again, this is really the grandfather of all spacesuits. This was kind of spacesuit number one, the first real pressure suit that had been developed for aviators to explore those regions. This is the helmet. And I love it. You can see how beautiful the weld is. And you have these kind of bolts here, so it would be screwed onto the rubber suit with wing nuts. Very, very basic. A rubber hose to pump air in, and this extraordinary porthole. And it looks exactly like a diving suit, or a suit of armor, or all the other things that we were looking at. So that's a wonderful thing. So this brings me into my first of my connections, which is this. This is a tomato worm caterpillar. Russell Coley, the engineer who worked with Wiley Post, one of the problems you have with developing a pressure suit is flexibility. Now, wearing something rubber, something like this, so a modeling balloon like this, when it's uninflated, okay, it's nice and floppy and flexible, and if I was to wear something like that, I could move around it. But as soon as you pressurize it, as well as expanding, something else happens. So I've got my little pump. So if I pump air into it, so it gets bigger, that's problem number one, but also it becomes rigid. It becomes sort of inflexible. Now, if I'm an astronaut and I want to explore the surface of the moon, that is a real problem. Well, you know, if that was the leg or an arm of my spacesuit, if I kind of bend it, it's going to kink. And that was a real problem. And so the real design challenge for pressure suit design and for spacesuit design is how do you overcome the pressure flexibility conundrum? And actually, Russell Coley, the story was, he was sitting in his garden, and he noticed a tomato worm caterpillar crawling along a twig. And he noticed that the caterpillar could bend its body and yet maintain the same internal volume. And he wondered how it did it, and he studied it. And of course, he realized that a caterpillar's body has convolutes in it. Convolutes, these kind of joints, a bit like a drinking straw. Like if you bend a drinking straw, it'll kink, but the little ridges, the little concertina bit of a drinking straw allows you to bend it. And spacesuit design, they call these convolutes. This allows you to pressurize a suit, but again, maintain flexibility. This is one of the most famous early spacesuits of all, pressure suits. It was called the tomato worm suit, named after Russell Coley's tomato worm epiphany. And you can see how the astronaut can suddenly start to move and bend as opposed to being rigid, which is very important, especially if you want to explore another planet. This suit may look familiar to some of you. It was used for this. It became the kind of the model for the first. This is the first real spacesuit that Tintin used to explore the moon. Russell Coley, and then they've even got a dog spacesuit down there for Snowy. But that was the original sort of tomato worm suit. It inspired a whole culture of spacesuits, of our imaginations, which is nice. Here we go. And if we look at some slightly later patents, so this is actually from about 1960, we can see how those convolutes have really kind of worked their way through into spacesuit design through to the sort of early 1960s. So this is a Krupp spacesuit. Again, it's all about flexibility. It's all about being able to pressurize and be able to move. I've got a little film. This was very kindly given to me by the BBC. This is a little clip of an early, very, very early I think this is early 1960s of a pressure suit to show you how they work. So let's have a little look at this. Oh, hang on. Oh, come on. Hang on. Let's see if we can do this.
I think we should now consider one of the most important accessories of such a space flight. That is, the space suit.
Well, Doctor, that's just what I want to ask you about. This forerunner of the spacesuit developed for the RAF, which we're now going to see publicly for the first time. Just how big a step forward is it?
Well, there's a very long step between the partial pressure suit, which has been shown before, and this particular suit you see now. Perhaps we can have this inflated and you can see the action. See, space is a vacuum and the suit has to be pressurized.
I think it looks like every boy's idea of a real spacesuit.
Can you move around?
take it off.
One of the most difficult engineering problems in designing such a suit is to provide an adequate range of physical movement whilst the man is pressurized.
Well, I can see you seem to move around all right. Were you uncomfortable? You're sweating furiously now, but were you really uncomfortable in it?
I was a little hot. I think the reason there is that if you are hot and you don't get sufficient ventilation, then, of course, you just sweat and get even worse.
Very important to wear a suit and tie, obviously, when wearing a spacesuit. I forgot 1957. That clip is blimey. That was kind of Sputnik was 57, so that was before anyone had gone into space. We were thinking about making things like spacesuits. I love that clip. It's great. Hard versus soft. So the Apollo A7-L suits that they wore on the surface of the moon, obviously a soft suit, but people in the 1960s were experimenting with a hard suit. Basically, could you wear like a sort of tin can? Obviously, wearing something like that, it gives you a constant volume of pressure, so easier to pressurize, and obviously that's important in terms of things like breathing, but of course you have a flexibility issue. But I wanted to show you these because they are such beautiful objects as well. Just the design that went into some of these early spacesuits are so fabulous, and how reminiscent they are of that early suit of armor that I showed you. You know, medieval people thinking about how are we going to go into battle and working with extraordinary materials, and just the similarities in terms of aesthetics between something like this and a suit of armor is just gorgeous. But I love these joints. I've got another one here, which another suit here. Oh, come on, clicker. This is another one which I absolutely adore. These joints are called stovepipe joints for obvious reasons, and they allow flexibility and movement, but not a whole lot. But just as design objects, I think they are absolutely gorgeous, and I want one for my house. I wanted to show you a close-up of my favorite detail of this particular suit, which was never used. This was designed at NASA Ames, but it was never used. It was a prototype. But what I love is, it's the AX2, but look at the stars and stripes on it. What I love about it is this was hand-painted on the suit. The very first time the stars and stripes was actually put on a spacesuit was during the Gemini missions. The astronauts themselves decided to put it on. And then from then on, it's been on all the suits. But if you look at the stars, you can see how beautifully crafted they are, how beautifully drawn it is. And I love to be able to see the craft and the actually there. Normally we just see kind of a sticker or something, but that's rather nice. This is my favorite. This was another early sort of hard suit prototype designed for exploring the moon. 1960s. A spaceman could use this suit while exploring the moon and even rest in it if he's on a long hike. It's equipped with retractable tripod legs that will hold it off the ground and a built-in seat that he can curl up while easing his tired feet. You know, what I love about the story of the spacesuit is it's such a brilliant example of how engineering works. You don't just get it right first time. You don't go from nothing to a spacesuit. You have to start with the invention of sewing and then move your way through time and then get things wrong, really badly wrong. But it's a beautiful object as well. And if you look at his hands, this gentleman inside, again wearing a shirt and tie, just two kind of spanners. This is nice. The controls are inside. The controls are inside the cylinder, along with shelves of food for lengthy trips. You know, that when I go to the moon, that's what I want. But you can imagine already the engineering problems with a suit like that. Here's another one. Oh, I think this is another sort of Apollo prototype suit of the same era. So this is 1968. Actually, well, Apollo was in full swing in 1968. But when they were thinking about actually exploring the moon, this was another idea, a combination of hard and soft. So you've got that tin can top bit and these wonderful kind of convolute bellowed arms here and a stovepipe joint here. Alan B. Hazard invented that. They actually built this suit. This one was actually made and tested in the Nevada desert. And it's just visually it's so good. You know, you'd want that, wouldn't you? Like in your house, just to have around. I would wear that. I think it's good. Aesthetics, well, while we're talking about aesthetics, aesthetics is, we mustn't underestimate, when we talk about engineering and design, let's not underestimate aesthetics, because form and function are important, but aesthetics are very important. So late 1950s, early 60s, okay, this suit here, this is the Project Mercury. So 1961, Alan Shepard became the first American to do his suborbital flight. They needed a spacesuit, or they needed a high-altitude suit. And again, they went to the B.F. Goodrich company to design them a suit. And actually what they used was just an Air Force pressure suit. But because this idea of the astronaut was new, this idea of exploring space, the Americans needed to kind of sell that to the public, this exciting new breed of superhero. And of course, they turned to Buck Rogers, who was the great superhero at the time, and they thought, okay, well, the Navy Mark IV pressure suit, which is what the naval aviators used at the time, it was a kind of dull green. So they decided to spray paint it silver, just so it looked like the Buck Rogers suit. I mean, they said it was for, in fact, this is it. So this is, if you can see here, this is a photograph I took of the two suits. This is a Navy Mark IV pressure suit of that era, and this is a Mercury suit. And so they gave it a sort of aluminized coating to give it that silvery Buck Rogers look. They said it was for that. They said it was for thermal properties, but the PR-ness of silver spacesuits became evident. And here we are. This is the first group of American astronauts, and you can see why you'd want a silver spacesuit. If you want to look Buck Rogers, you've got to go silver. But have a look at the front, actually. So John Glenn and Deke Slayton at the front here. If you look at their boots, you'll notice a difference between these two boots and these two boots. So this was the very famous photograph that was taken for Life magazine. But actually, John Glenn and Deke Slayton, they forgot their boots for the shoot, so they just got some work boots and spray painted them because they forgot. So when you look at that picture, always remember to look at their boots, and there's a nice little story. Okay, so we did tomato worms we talked about. The other one I want to talk about is the Beatles, because that silver spacesuit wasn't just about protecting astronauts. This was a very famous Harper's Bazaar magazine from the 1960s. This is Richard Avedon, who was a photographer, took that silver spacesuit and put Gene Shrimpton in it and put Paul McCartney in it. And you can see that suit became such an iconic symbol of that particular period. This one, again, we've seen quite recently. This one's doing the round. This is a Richard Avedon picture from that particular issue of Harper's Bazaar from the 1960s, talking about this new world of exploring the universe, which is very exciting. And of course, when you want to explore the universe, explore space, you've got to do it in a silver spacesuit. Okay, so that was the Beatles connection. So Beatles, caterpillar worm. I want to talk about the rubber tree now, the rubber tree, because this suit here was designed by a company and built by a company called Playtex. Playtex make women's bras and underwear. And again, Playtex, the division of Playtex was actually a company called ILC, the International Latex Corporation. Of course, we get latex from rubber. And they chose Playtex because Playtex knew all about how to design clothing that people could move in, particularly women could move in. They experimented with different materials. And of course, they had wonderful seamstresses who knew how to sew. So the ILC Corporation, this is the Playtex advert of the period. You've got Zsa Zsa Gabor up there talking about, call Playtex the perfect girdle. So the whole history of the Apollo suit really came from this idea of movement, of flow of the body, of elegance, of restraint. And so this was the real sort of genesis of the A7-L suit. So here are a couple of early examples, a couple of early prototypes of this suit. These are the two suits that really got ILC the contract to make it. So this is, you can see this prototype. Again, we see the Russell Coley convolutes here. Gloves are very difficult, so they didn't bother with gloves for that one. But this is the real first kind of genesis of the A7-L suit proper. Well, certainly underneath, this is the sort of internal pressure bladder you can see. And this is what that suit looks like underneath, so you can actually see how it all works. The white bit of the spacesuit is really just a micrometeoroid garment that protects from abrasion and particles whizzing about. It's made of beta cloth, very, very tough, very, very resistant, like a suit of armor, but actually the pressure bit is what's underneath, and that's exactly what it looks like. The other important thing about spacesuit design is materials and layering. So the A7-L was made of 21 layers of different materials, all kind of exotic materials at the time. They weren't invented for spacesuits, but this was this whole new revolution of materials in the 1950s and 60s. Nylon, Nomex, Mylar, Dacron, Teflon, Kapton, neoprene, lycra, vinyl tubing, all these new exciting materials were suddenly available that couldn't be used before. And if we look at a cross-section of a spacesuit cut in half, you get an idea of all the different layers that are used. The liquid cooling garment, I think I've got actually, let's just have a look. Here's a kind of cutaway here. This wonderful picture, this is a NASA archive picture, this wonderful cutaway. You can see how all the layering works together, and a little bit of very important, things like pencil pockets. You know, that's important. And there's lots of pen light pockets. Well, these are all very good. Very quickly, the vinyl tubing garment. So this is an Apollo era, what we call a liquid cool garment. It's basically a spandex onesie, and it's got vinyl tubing that acts as a kind of radiator. Water is pumped through, and that actually gets rid of the heat. Because with spacesuits, the one thing they're not is breathable. It's not like your kind of your sort of camping jacket. So they had this vinyl tubing. It's called a water-cooled garment. And actually, it was Spitfire pilots used it very similar. So this is an RAF water-cooled garment. Spitfire pilots used exactly the same thing. So Apollo water-cooled garment, the sort of origins comes from that. The other thing I wanted to mention in my little connections list, so the Beatles, Caterpillar we've done latex, rubber tree. To-do list. This is my favorite bit. This is actually Neil Armstrong's glove from the Smithsonian. And that picture I showed you of Buzz Aldrin, the most famous photograph of all time, you see Buzz Aldrin, and he's got his hand slightly cocked like that when he's standing. And the reason is that the engineers thought, well, okay, when they're actually doing their EVA on the lunar surface, how are they going to remember what they have to do? Turn on camera, plant flag, pick up rocks, there's a whole, do experiments, how are they going to remember? And so one of the engineers came up with this idea of like, well, you know when you're in an exam and you cheat and you just kind of write it on your sleeve? And so a to-do list was actually sewn on to the sleeve of the garment here, the EVA glove. And you can read it. So this is actually what was written on Neil Armstrong's glove. And you can go through it line by line and actually check off exactly what was done on the moon. So everything from camera things, lots of photography, picking up soil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got their to-do lists right there. So they didn't have to sort of pull out, you know, lists and things. And still on spacesuits now, they have longer ones with little kind of booklets on so they can see. But the left hand is where it is. This is a picture I took. This is just talking about the EVA, actually, because you'll notice on my spacesuit here, this is the spacesuit configuration for being inside the spacecraft. And as soon as you need to step out of the spacecraft, you need a few extra bits. This is actually Gene Cernan's EVA boot. That kind of dark gray material is a material called Chrome LR, which is a titanium, very, very fine, almost like a chainmail, very, very hard to work with. But it was designed because the Lunar Regolith is incredibly abrasive. I've actually got some Lunar Regolith here in my little pot. This is moon dust, or simulant moon dust, which the government space agencies use to actually kind of, you know, do experiments with. It's very, very abrasive, very, very fine. And so they had to come up with this Chrome LR fabric, which is very, very tough. I love that picture. And again, there you go. There's the tread of the boots made of silicon. And there is the one of the. I'm going to have to. I'm running out of time. I want to show you. But of course, that boot, again, a little bit like the Mercury spacesuit, found its way within culture as a whole. And of course, the moon boot of the 1970s, which you may have had a pair. My mother had a pair of those, and we could all pretend we were astronauts. But the real heroes for me of this design, this iconic design, were the women of Playtex who actually did the sewing. And if we look at Buzz Aldrin's suit, this is a photograph I took of Buzz Aldrin's suit, you can see how beautifully crafted and how beautifully stitched they were. Each one of those stitches is 1/64th of an inch. Each stitch was measured, each suit was x-rayed. And if we zoom in really close, you can start to make out the weave of the fabric and how beautifully crafted those stitches are. They are a work of art. And if we look really close, this is actually looking at the fabric through a microscope just to see, so scientists can see how Lunar Regolith, these kind of blobs here, have actually affected the materials themselves. So when we're designing spacesuits for the future, we can understand. Now you can see how dirty they get. This is Gene Cernan on the way back from the moon, Apollo 17, and you can see how filthy those suits were. This Lunar Regolith on the moon, not here, but it becomes electrically charged and it sticks to everything and penetrates everything. And so it's a real, well, it's a blessing because we can use it for all kinds of things, but it's also a boon when it comes to spacesuit design. A little clip, I showed some of you this yesterday if you were at my first talk, but I want to show you this little clip again because it shows some of the women at work, and I think this is it's my favorite clip ever, so I'm going to show you some of the women at Playtex sewing spacesuits.
As for man, however, we're stuck with the original model. All we can do is add an outer layer of things he does not naturally have. Space medicine showed us where man is vulnerable, and we learned to compensate for most of the weaknesses with technology and careful workmanship.
I made boxing gloves before I came here, and the fact is I was an experienced sewer, but I had to learn all over again because it was completely different from what I had sewed before. This was getting right down to a 64th of an inch, and where I had sewed before, you just sewed on a production line. And this here is quality more than quantity.
Like, we always think our job is the hardest. Whatever we're doing, we got the hardest job. But when they say, well, go over there and maybe do so-and-so, well, you'll find out that job is harder than yours. And a lot of times we're sewing or making things, and maybe the girl next to you, she's doing the same thing, but we never see the suit put together. One don't know where this part goes, or the other one don't know where the other part goes. Like the gloves. If they would give you a glove to sew, you wouldn't know where to start.
Well, when they're up there in space, you know what parts you've worked on, and you just say, well, I hope that part don't fail because I feel it was my fault if it did.
My sentiments is what Hazel said. Well, I was just wondering if my pair of gloves was what he had on.
If you make a mistake, if you don't admit it, you have to think about the astronaut too. If you make like a needle hole in the bladder or something like that, well, if you don't admit that, that would be on your conscience all the time, seems to me. Because I remember Armstrong and all them used to come in, and they would look around and see what we were doing. And once in a while they'd talk to us and sign we'd get them to sign their autograph. Some of them were real comical. We got a kick out of them. We all wanted to talk to them, I guess. I remember one of them going down the aisle, everybody looked at him, afraid to talk. I said, hi, buddy.
Oh, I'd love to go into space. I think it would be really thrilling just to get in there and just blast off.
I'd love to go to space and just live there.
Every day you get up, you come to work, you go home, you clean house. If we go out there, there's no house, no kids, no problems.
I like to ride in an airplane, and I think I'd like to go into space. And I'd like to wear our own suit that we make. I think I could depend on it.
After body electrodes have been attached to monitor heartbeat and breathing, the first items of clothing are the water-cooled underwear and a urine collector. A spacesuit is basically a sealed bag of atmosphere, a stiffened balloon, pumped up to counteract the vacuum of space. It might be called a one-man spaceship of the smallest possible dimensions. The pressure suit has to guard against extreme temperatures, hard radiation from the sun, and tiny meteorites. Yet, it must have the flexibility to allow man to function as he would in his natural Earth environment. The backpack cleans and cools the suit's oxygen, cools and circulates water through the water-cooled underwear, and provides radio communication. Over the pressure helmet is a clear visor, then a gold-coated visor to protect against micrometeors and solar radiation. The final test.
I love that. It's from a documentary, if you're interested. It's called Moonwalk 1. Which is available on DVD. My friend Chris Riley didn't produce the original, but has re-released it. It's a wonderful documentary, Moonwalk 1. Just very quickly, it's funny, you know, you're going to hear a lot of three names mentioned a lot today and tomorrow. You're going to hear Neil Armstrong, you're going to hear Buzz Aldrin, and you're going to hear Michael Collins, the crew of Apollo 11. But actually, when you hear those names and when you see pictures of them on the moon, remember these names. These are some of the names of the workers at Playtex who did the stitching. Some of those names, in fact, they never get mentioned anymore, and I think it's a real shame because they are part of the army of 400,000 people that made Apollo happen. Michelle Tice, Julia Brown, Delma Austin, Dolores Arolas, and Doris Boise. Those amazing women who made it all possible, and we never ever mention their names, and it's a real shame. So there you go. Think of them when you see Buzz Aldrin on the moon. Very, very quickly, because I'm running out of time. David Newman, she's a scientist at MIT developing another kind of suit, a skin suit. So rather than using gas pressure, actually thinking about using mechanical pressure, constricting the body. This was a suit called the gravity-loading skin suit that was designed to help astronauts on the International Space Station. Because when you're working in microgravity, zero gravity, your bones and muscles start to waste away. And this was a prototype suit that was actually worn, I think Thomas Morgenson wore it on the ISS, and it's full of kind of these rubber, almost like wearing bungee cords that kind of restricts the body. And so when you do move, it's exercising muscles and joints. And this, the Z3, this is another ILC suit that they're developing for thinking about exploring. Oh, here we go. Yeah, this is that suit. Here we go from the International Space Station, designed to keep astronauts healthy. I'm whizzing through now because I'm kind of running out of time. Just really quickly, legacy. Spacesuits. We talked a little bit about form and function, but they mean so much more than that. This is the three spacesuits that we are celebrating this weekend. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins. They are the most beautiful objects. They are such an important part of our cultural history of that era. They're instantly recognizable. We know exactly what they are. We know exactly what they mean. They mean much more than just keeping three people alive in space. They are part of our world down here. These suits now are all in the Smithsonian, being wonderfully looked after. Kathleen Lewis and Lisa Young look after all the suits, making sure they're all catalogued and documented and looked after. And this is actually Neil Armstrong's suit from a few years ago, which was in very, very bad condition. And they did some amazing work getting it back into shape for display. This suit that you can see on stage here was made by this gentleman, Ryan Agasa. Ryan makes props for movies. He did some of the suits for the first man, Neil Armstrong pick, and he's an incredible artist who, a little bit like me, fell in love with the story of the spacesuit and took it upon himself as a prop maker to make absolutely perfect reproductions of them, because all the sort of design, from ILC don't really exist anymore. So he's been making them from scratch, and this is an example of one of his suits on stage. This is him with the Apollo 16 astronaut Charlie Duke. This is one of the later A7Ls from a later Apollo missions. You'll notice the later Apollo missions, they have a red stripe on the knees and the arms and the helmet, and that is just for identification. So the ground control can know which astronaut's which. So the person with a red stripe is the commander. So this is in Ryan's workshop making the suits. They're absolutely perfect. This is one he made for his daughter, which I really love. So if you want one of these, Ryan will make you one. There's kind of a waiting list, and they're not cheap, but they're really amazing. And this is me. I've been very lucky. I work for a charity called Teen Tech, and one of the things we do is we go around schools all around Britain, and we use spacesuit design as a way of getting kids' creative juices flowing. And we get them to design spacesuits, thinking about what spacesuits are for and why you would need them. And so this was a school I was at the other day, and this is some of the examples of when you ask kids to design a spacesuit and to think about where they might be going and what it might be used for. This is what they'll come up with. Anyway, I've run out of time, but it's been such a pleasure. That was kind of act 3 of my 3-act talk, and it's been so wonderful to be back at Blue Dot today and to be able to share some of these stories and a little bit of a context, wider context about Apollo and engineering. So thank you very, very much indeed. It's been a huge pleasure, and enjoy today.